I want you to put yourselves in the shoes of a first century Roman centurion named Cornelius. Cornelius was from Italy, and he found himself stationed in a place called Caesarea Maritima. This was the capital of Roman Judea. And perhaps while there, he becomes acquainted with the God of the Bible. He starts to hear about Judaism. He starts to maybe attend the synagogue where possible. He starts to give alms and praying to God and doing what he could to follow God as a Roman centurion. But there are some things that Roman centurions just can't do. And so one day while Cornelius is praying, an angel appears to him and says, "Cornelius, your prayers and your alms to the poor, they've arisen to God. He's heard you. And you need to send to Joppa to bring back a man named Peter who has a message from the Lord for you." And so Cornelius obeys immediately. He sends messengers to find Peter. And when he hears that the messengers and Peter are close, he gathers together all his closest friends, all his family, to hear what Peter might say. And Peter comes in, and Peter says, "You yourselves know how it's unlawful for me, a Jew, to associate it with you, Gentile sinners." And if I was Cornelius, I'd be like, "Peter, what the heck are you talking about here? What do you mean it's unlawful?" But I think Cornelius knew exactly what Peter was saying, because Cornelius had been around the Jews in Caesarea. Maybe he wanted to invite a rabbi over to talk a little bit more about the Bible and about the prophets. He wouldn't have come. Or maybe a friend in the market. He wanted to spend more time with him, inviting him to his home to show him hospitality. He wouldn't have come. And why? The answer is because none of these Jews wanted to risk becoming unclean by association with Cornelius. They didn't want to do it. But Peter was here, and so something had changed in Peter's heart. And what Cornelius didn't know is that God had been working on Peter. And just a few days ago, God had given a vision to Peter. And that vision was of a great white sheet descending on a roof where Peter was praying. And on that sheet was all sorts of unclean animals. And Peter was told by God to rise, kill, and eat. And Peter, thinking this was a test from God, said, "No way, I've never eaten anything uncommon or unclean." He was thinking, I've passed the test. But God says, "Don't call common what I have called clean." And 3 times this happens. 3 times the sheet comes down, he's told to kill, and Peter says no, and then God says, "Don't call common what I have called clean." And at the end of that vision, Peter comes down from the rooftop, and he's perplexed. He doesn't understand what it all means. But in that moment, the messengers from Cornelius arrives, and God's Spirit tells Peter to go with them and accompany them without hesitation. Or my Bible has a footnote that says, accompany them, making no distinction. And so God is working on Peter, and he gets to Cornelius' house, and the place where he probably wouldn't have gone just a few days ago, inside a Gentile sinner's home. He goes inside, and he says, "I've come because God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean." And Peter proceeds to tell Cornelius the message that God had been giving him. And he says, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." That word acceptable is key, because this is exactly what Jews would have been afraid of Cornelius going to his home about. They want to be acceptable to God. They don't want to become unclean. And God had created all these rules about how a holy God can be worshipped by an unholy people, how an impure people can come into the presence of a pure God. And part of that was the purity laws, the ceremonial laws, the kosher food laws. And they weren't going to risk being unacceptable to God by going and eating with Cornelius. But Peter says, "I've come to understand something about what it means to be acceptable to God, that you must fear him and do what is right." And a little bit further in verse 43, "To him," that's Jesus, "all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name." And while Peter is preaching, the Spirit falls upon that house. And the very same thing that happened to the Jews at Pentecost happens to the Gentiles here in Cornelius' house. They begin speaking in tongues, and the Holy Spirit is poured out, and they're extolling and they're praising God. And Peter and the Jews there cannot help but see that Gentiles too have become fitting vessels for God's Spirit to dwell in. And what Peter becomes to understand, I have heard one pastor say, is that salvation is not of race, it's all of grace. That is, God's family is not constrained to merely people who are descendant from Abraham by blood or people who live in Judea. What he comes to understand is truly that God can save anyone, and he can make anyone fitting vessels for his Spirit to dwell in. That salvation is not about race, it's not about who you are, it's all about his grace.